Hi everyone, meteorologist Joe Chaffee on this Thursday where we're seeing very warm temperatures running up the eastern seaboard all the way up to Maine. Everybody's above freezing. Temperatures in the 50s in upstate New York and even into the 50s in parts of interior New England. And we've got 60s now across Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, down into Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, all ahead of this cold front that is running up through the Ohio Valley and Midwest, northern parts of the Ohio Valley and Midwest, and there are some showers that were showing up on the radar ahead of the front to the west and north. Whether they survive or not remains to be seen, but you can see the colder air that's behind all this with temperatures in the 20s, teens, and single digits. And there's actually a little reinforcing surge of cold air that's back through the Dakotas, where you've got temperatures running minus 15, minus 25 across south central Canada, and a lot of below zero readings all across North Dakota and into Montana. And we go down to the south and west. You know, I've kind of not been talking about what's been happening in California with the big snows and the big storm that's been happening there. I have to tell you, because we are so East Coast focused, that I just don't pay too much attention to the weather out there, and I don't understand the local climatology enough to venture any kind of what I would say a more expert opinion about what may happen there. So it's not that I'm trying to necessarily avoid the subject. It's just that I don't want to say something that winds up being, totally wrong. But this is how it is. Everybody, weather people, with where they live, they know their own environment. That's kind of where their knowledge base is, and it gets much harder to forecast for places where you're not physically, actually there. But no matter. We do have some changes coming here in the east, so let me just show you what's happening. We do have the chance for some snow out of this on Saturday. Here's our weather front that moves through tonight, and then the big high just builds across to Wisconsin, Minnesota. You can see it right here. That's a very strong high. Even though the upper air is not especially cold, we don't live in the upper atmosphere. We live in the bottom of the atmosphere, and this occasionally happens where you get these big highs to develop that create large pools of cold air at the bottom part of the atmosphere, and that's really what we're dealing with here. Now the high is going to wedge down along the east coast, and there's a little wave, a little ripple that develops during the day on Saturday, and weather models have gotten really subdued with this. Earlier this week it had a nice little shot of precip that would have had given snows on the order of 2 to 4 or maybe even a little bit higher than that, but they've gotten a bit more subdued. And I guess I have to follow along with that idea. And you can see that wave moves out. Now, beyond that, another high builds into the northeast. And I'm going to have to watch to see how this plays out, because there are a few things that are happening that with respect to the longer term that I think we're going to need to pay attention to. But let's get back to this first event. This is the new GFS run, by the way. So you can see that area of snow here and some ice, at least on this particular model. That's what it's going with. And let's look at the snowfall forecast out of this because, it's doing a few things that I would kind of expect it to do here. You can see the northern fringe of precip makes it just to about New York City, showing mostly a coating. And then you get into some several inch amounts down in parts of north central Maryland, and even south central Maryland into northwestern Virginia, some 4-inch plus amounts there. I don't know how real that is. We look at the 24-hour precip. That's probably a better way to look at these things than the snowfall map. Let me get a little tighter. The reason why is that I like to kind of look at what the liquid precip is and maybe guess at what the ratio is going to be. But when we look at this first event in terms of 24-hour snowfall and in terms of moisture, you can see on the GFS model that it barely brings up a couple of hundredths to a tenth to Long Island, and then maybe a tenth of an inch or so across New Jersey, a little bit more in extreme southern New Jersey, southeastern Pennsylvania. And then you start to get into these 3 and 4/10 inch amounts around the Washington, D.C. Area and points to the south. So I still think the greatest concentration of snow is going to be in this particular area. Now, the NAM model today is a little more bullish. When I say bullish, I mean more favorable for snow. If I use the term bearish, it would be in the other direction. It has a little bit more of an expansive area of precip, ever so slightly, and it actually makes the emphasis a little further to the north. There seems to be some kind of little upper air disturbance on the NAM that comes through and energizes this to some degree, and that's why it produces the snow where it does, where it takes it up into southern New England and into the Hudson Valley, parts of eastern Pennsylvania. But notice there's a lot of breaks up here, so you got to wonder what this really is going to be when it's all said and done, and then just kind of falls apart as it moves away to the east early Sunday morning. So the NAM's idea in terms of snowfall is, maybe a coating to an inch on the northern fringe, and then it's got 1 to 2, 3 inch amounts as you go south across New Jersey, and a little stripe here of 4 inch plus amounts across southern Pennsylvania into north central Maryland, and then it lessens those amounts as you go to the south. So it's kind of opposite of what the GFS does with this first event. Now, with respect to the long range, I want to show you just a couple of things that are happening. First off, the fact that next week is probably going to be, let's call it a thaw week for the most part. But even though the East Pacific Oscillation Index, which measures, it's a measure of pressure changes basically in the Pacific, in the eastern part of the Pacific, and when it's positive, as it is here, and this is off the wall positive, it tends to favor warmer air in the east. When it goes negative, it tends to favor colder air in the eastern part of the United States. Now, I think that's this big off the wall positive number is probably going to be somewhat offset by the fact that the North Atlantic Oscillation, or what we call the Greenland block, this would favor higher pressures at the poles and displacement of cold air southward, does go negative early next week. Not by a lot, but it does go negative, and then it kind of stays negative or trends back to neutral or slightly negative right through the end of the month. The East Pacific Oscillation Index, let me just shut that off. The East Pacific Oscillation Index trends down to neutral toward January 24th, 25th, 26th. So that would start to tell us that the atmosphere may be starting to turn to a little colder look overall. And the other development that I think is important is that for the first time, we're seeing these spikes of positive numbers with the Pacific North America Index. And this is important because when the Pacific North America Index is positive, it favors a ridge building in the western part of the United States, and that tends to favor troughs in the east. High positive PNAs can come with storm development in the eastern United States. It's not forecasting that, but it's creating essentially the condition. So what you look at after that is to see where the troughs set up, where the ridges set up, and I think this is all going to be very important for us to look going forward into the end of January and the beginning of February, because there's a lot of long-range chatter about February with things going on in the stratosphere. There's always this kind of chatter. I gave it a look, and I think that we could be going into a colder and stormier period. But you know what? We've traveled that road down before in the long range, and it didn't necessarily come out to be the way you thought it would. You might think it would be. So let's let that just play itself out. And in the meantime, I just want to show you. I'll show you a couple of things here with regards to where we're going forward. Let's go to the GFS. I don't have it out only to day 6, and now you'll notice that what happens. Okay, so here's that next weather system that runs up to the west for early next week. I think this might wind up being a little bit of a colder look. That high might build a little stronger, so there might be a bit more of snow and ice ahead of it. we'll see. There's a bit of a warm front here, so wants to take a weak low up to the west, and after that, there isn't, the blue line, the blue dash line here, the 540 thickness line, basically a measure of the of how cold the atmosphere is. And this is where we usually look for the rain snow line, roughly around that 540 measurement. Notice that it's nowhere it's actually except for just touching across the upper peninsula of Michigan. It's way to the north. Okay, I mean it's in Canada, so this is fairly mild across the United States, if this is right. And when you look at the upper air, it kind of makes sense. So we'll show you what the upper air looks like at about the same point, and we'll get to that. And you can see here again the way the jet stream is. It's just kind of a mess. You have pretty much a westerly flow coming off the Pacific, and there's no polar flow. You don't have a jet that comes down this way at all, and cold air is basically confined to these regions up here to the north. So this is where it would be cold, and that cold air can't get down here because the upper air winds are blowing from west to east on this illustration. And this is forecast for next Wednesday. Now, I'm going to go back to the earlier run of the GFS, and when we take this through over time, you can see what starts to happen as we get through after January 22nd or 23rd. Canada's profile changes so that as we go to, and the model's been doing this for several runs now, but here's the pattern at the end of the period, and now you've got that flow coming out of Canada. You've got this ridge building up in the west. You also have a ridge building out in the Atlantic along 40 degrees west toward Greenland. So that's going to try to essentially trap a bit of a vortex down in eastern Canada. So if this is right, you're going to get a colder flow. Also, notice in the Pacific too, you've got a deep trough that extends down off the Pacific coast. So that supports this ridge to build up in the west. So I think this is what the long-range models are seeing. Whether that again comes to play or not is another matter. Let's take a look at last night's European upper air and show you. Now, this is an interesting upper air pattern for the European toward the end of the period. It's quite blocky. You've got higher pressures all up in here through Canada. I mean, that's very important because now it does displace this sort of active Pacific jet to the south. The polar flow is questionable. However, in a situation like this, you might be able to get some kind of cold air from eastern Canada to gradually drain southward into the eastern states. Hard to say in terms of specifics, but it's kind of an interesting look in terms of the blockiness. And I think the longer range models are, given what I showed you with the indices before, are pointing to this idea. So we'll keep you up to date on what we expect in the short range going into this weekend with this minor snow event that's coming up for the eastern states. Doesn't look like any big storms going on throughout much of the country. Let me just give the west one last look here. I don't want to neglect you folks out that like the West Coast weather. I try to cover all angles, and I know some people apparently get upset by that, but what can I tell you? So I'll go back to the GFS so we can look at the precip on this, and let's take a look. So you've got that California system finally moves out and then moves into New Mexico and Texas, so that produces some snows in Colorado and West Kansas, if that's right, early next week. And then another strong system comes into the Pacific Northwest this time around, and it looks like it spreads another round, if this is right, later next week down into California and western Nevada and up through parts of Oregon. I think this may be more elevation driven than anything else because of the fact, well, always is elevation driven, but perhaps the snow levels might be a bit higher this time around because of the lack of cold air throughout much of the United States. And other than that, it doesn't really look like anything in terms of big storms going on. So, it's a thaw week in my view that we're looking ahead to next week, and then after that, maybe things are going to get decidedly more bullish for wintertime weather to return for the last part of January and for February. And I just want to point out that, the winter of 14-15 really didn't get underway until mid-January for the eastern part of the United States, and it wasn't until we got into February and after the half blizzard in late January that really set everything off for the rest of the month and right through the month of March. It was especially cold for that 2-month stretch. So if that kind of thing happens again, wouldn't be unusual. Latest posts on the website, meteorologistjoechaffee.com. Download my app, subscribe to my forecast, just $1 a month. Cheaper than a cup of coffee at Starbucks, or as I like to call it, $4. So that's for New York City, Long Island, New Jersey, Hudson Valley, and Eastern Pennsylvania. Everybody have a great Thursday, and we will talk to you guys tomorrow.